Right, so anytime you have a pi over 6, pi over 3, so a 30, 60, or 90 degree angle, you can divide each quadrant into 3 sections. So what we will have here is, if we take our quadrants, we are going to have 3 sections. So we'll have, that would create 2 sections, and then we draw another line. So 2 lines basically. So 1, 2, 3 sections. Draw this guy into 3 sections, this guy into 3 sections, this one into 3 sections. Now, you start with the first line division that you draw, and this becomes 1 pi over 6. So in the last section that we were talking about with pi over 4, when you divide it into 2 sections, your first line becomes 1 pi over 6. Here, when we divide each quadrant into 3 sections, our first line is going to be pi over 6. So we'll have 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, and remember, we always count every single line that is after that, so including the axis. So 3 pi over 6, which would reduce to pi over 2, 4 pi over 6, which of course would reduce to 2 pi over 3, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, which reduces, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6, and 12 pi over 6. And you can keep going until the end of time, but adding your pi over 6 as you go around. So the idea is, when you divide it into 3 sections, you then have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pi over 6 every single time. Now, from there, you need to be aware of your 30, 60 degree angles. So pi over 6, remember this y distance is smaller than this x distance. So this will be square root of 3 over 2, 1/2. Then when we go to our 60 degree angle, which of course is the same as pi over 3, that will be 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. And the thing is, you can use that pi over 3, pi over 6 as reference angles for the whole thing. So anytime you have a denominator of 3, it will have this coordinate, 1/2 square root of 3, off by a plus or minus. Anytime you have a denominator of 6, it will have this coordinate. So for example, if I look at the 4 pi over 6, yes, that reduces to 2 pi over 3. So that tells us that the 2 pi over 3 angle would correspond to what I have in quadrant 1 with a 3 of 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. If I look at 8 pi over 6, that would reduce to 4 pi over 3. So that tells us that this 4 pi over 3 angle would have the 1/2 square root of 3 over 2 as well. 10 pi over 6 reduces to 5 pi over 3. So because I end up with a 3, that would tell us that the 2 pi over 3, the 4 pi over 3, and the 5 pi over 3, all of those angles have this coordinate of 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. Now, it is off by a plus or a minus. So to figure out if it's going to be a positive or a negative, you have to use what you know about x and y being positive or negative in that quadrant. So if, for example, you look at 2 pi over 3, in 2 pi over 3, the quadrant is quadrant 2. In quadrant 2, your x is negative and your y is positive. So that would tell us that we would have a negative 1/2 and a positive square root of 3 over 2. Now, if you compare that to, let's say, 5 pi over 3, 5 pi over 3 is in quadrant 4, and in quadrant 4, x is positive, so you'd have a positive 1/2, but the y value is negative, so you'd have negative square root of 3 over 2. Okay? So if you look at, for example, finding the cosecant of 7 pi over 6, like they ask us to do here, our cosecant of 7 pi over 6, we would first have to remember that that is cosine of 7 pi over 6. Not cosine, excuse me. I'm thinking about the other question. Cosecant of 7 pi over 6 is going to be 1 over secant, 1 over sine of 7 pi over 6. Okay? So we would look at our unit circle. We would identify that 7 pi over 6 is here. Because it is a pi over 6 angle, it will have the same coordinate as 1 pi over 6. So it will be 1 over, so let's go ahead and write out 7 pi over 6 has the coordinate of square root of 3 over 2 comma 1/2. Now, because it is a sine value, remember it's cosine comma sine. Because it's a sine value, we're looking at 1/2. Now, you then have to figure out if it's positive or negative because it's not in quadrant 1. So 7 pi over 6 is over here in quadrant 3. In quadrant 3, your x is negative, your y is also negative. So at 7 pi over 6, you would have a negative square root of 3 over 2, negative 1/2. So that means that this 1/2 needs to be a negative. Now your final step is that you have 1 over negative 1/2, flip the denominator, and that gives you negative 2 for cosecant of 7 pi over 6.